So today we're starting Daniel 3, okay? And a lot of people are familiar with the story of the fiery furnace. But we're going to look at it, and we're going to find there's a lot more to it than just three guys that get thrown into a fire and, survive. Okay? Because what we're going to look at here, there's a lot of things going on. First thing we need to realize that when God is ever challenged, he doesn't shirk back from it. And men very foolishly challenge God all the time. We hear about it on the news. We hear about it from individuals maybe we talk to. But here's the point. No matter what man tries to do, God always prevails. There's really no exception to that. But man still tries. And part of the problem is that people have this interesting notion that because God doesn't punish sin instantly, that he is either unwilling or unable to do anything about it if he exists at all. Okay? I mean, a lot of, I remember over the years you had godly kids who would do something that they would consider ungodly, and then they would question, well, if God is so worried about me, why do you let me do it? And of course we know the answer. The answer is God gave us free will to make our own choices on how we behave. It is our choice. God really isn't going to stop us because he loves us so much. If we decide not to follow him, he's not going to impose himself on us. And what happens is people don't understand that, no, you're not getting away scot-free. For example, sin has its consequences. Ask anybody who's a former alcoholic. The long-term effects of alcohol on the body and the brain. Ask anybody who's a former drug addict. Same type of deal. Long-term effects. Some people sharing needles. I've known a couple of pastors who have hepatitis because of things they did a long time ago. Ask a woman who did a one-night stand who is now a single mom how sin has its consequences because things change radically. Okay? You also have so many diseases out there that can only be contracted if you engage in risky behavior. Okay? No mystery about that. Again, everybody knows this happens. And the sad part is sometimes these diseases get passed on to innocent people. Okay? And also, it seems to me that man's psyche is wired to view that any response to transgression has to be in terms of retribution and punishment. Think about when you were a kid. You did something. If you had a dad like mine, you got beat. Not spanked, beat. Okay? And if it was especially heinous sin, I'd get a spanking from my mom, and then my dad would come home, and obviously he never believed in double jeopardy. Okay, I get it all over again. And many view, if you look at this, instead of as retribution and punishment, you look at it in terms of mercy and grace, that's a sign of weakness. I mean, you think about, and I'm not going to ask anyone to tell me what they would do. Think about if you've ever been in a situation where somebody cuts you off on the highway. Okay? If you ever lived near a city, you know what I'm talking about. It happens almost all the time. Now, the usual response that people have, that they want to lash out, they want to lay on the horn, they want to scream at the top of their lungs as if the person you're screaming at can hear you with your windows closed over the sound of your horn. Okay? And if your window does happen to be open, you tell them that they're number one with the wrong finger. Okay? That's what you want to do. And there's even, I remember these little gadgets that were just buttons that had sound effects that you would paste on your dashboard. One would say missile, the other would say cannon, the other say phasers or whatever. So someone cut you off, you hit one of those buttons, and in your mind you're viewing this missile going, yeah, so satisfying. Whereas the proper response Even if your family and yourself have just been placed in danger by a knucklehead driver, and they're out there, I'm not going to deny it. The proper response, according to God, is grace and mercy. My usual response is, may you get to where you're going, and if you don't take anybody with you. I hope they make it safe. But if they don't, I hope that there's no innocent bystanders that are taken off by their lack of driving skill or their carelessness in driving. Okay? We need to not brood on our anger. We need to forgive, forget, and move on. And this doesn't come naturally to anybody. Okay? Forgive and forget? No, it's seek and destroy. I mean, if you think about it, that's how we're wired. And of course, the world, that's naturally seek and destroy is what the world wants. So anybody who's into mercy and grace, again, that's a sign of weakness. So they look at God, if he exists, he's weak because he doesn't do anything about all that's going on. And even the world sees, there's a lot going on out there that ain't right. All these people getting murdered, war in Ukraine, trouble between China and Taiwan. The list goes on, and the unsaved said, well, if God exists, why is he letting it happen? Well, here's the thing. Grace and mercy, you may not understand it. God understands it totally because he will use that opportunity to try to bring people back to him. But don't be deceived. When the time comes, punishment, retribution, or let's face it, the word judgment will take place, and your easy time just left. Now here in Daniel 3, we're going to see this play out. Okay? Now, go there, if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and go to verse 1 of chapter 3. Okay? Now to get a little review, remember not last week because we had Adam's Road last week, but the week before when we looked through, 2 weeks ago, when we looked through chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Daniel was finally called. He interpreted the dream. He actually had to jump an extra step. He actually had to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was. He did that correctly, then interpreted it. And remember the dream, Nebuchadnezzar was looking, and there's this huge statue with a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, and so on down the line to the feet of iron and clay. And then at the end, this huge stone that was made without hands hit the statue right on the feet, and the whole thing basically self-destructed and turned into dust, which was blown away by the wind, and the rock, or the stone, became a huge mountain that basically covered the entire world. And in the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar was basically told, you are the head of gold. And the reason was that he was the supreme ruler. He not only had the power to do as he wanted, there was no human law that restricted his actions. He could decide to do something and then think about it for a bit and then change his mind and not worry about any repercussions because he could. That's how much power he had, and that was why his was gold, and the rest of those kingdoms that were represented by the rest of the statues were inferior because there were checks and balances on the ruler. Like with the Persians, there was a rule that if the king made a decree, he couldn't change it, even if it was a stupid decree, which led to the downfall of the Persian Empire, because if he went on some foolhardy military expedition and it turned out this was a bad idea, he really couldn't retreat because that would be going back on his decree, so they basically would get slaughtered. Yeah. Now Nebuchadnezzar, he was ruthless. He did a lot of cruel things, but if you really look into history, he did not abuse his power, at least in the ways that we think of someone abusing power. He never did something simply because he could, or because he was bored, or he needed to break up the day, or his liver was bothering him, or something like that. When he did something, he had a goal. And his ulterior motive was always for the glory of Babylon and its gods, the stabilization of the kingdom, and of course his own glory. So no, he wasn't going to discriminately kill people just for fun. There was a reason why. And if it turned out he was wrong, he just as quickly would change his mind and says, no, you guys are okay. Okay? And again, Noah, if you go down in history, Noah the king had that kind of power. Right? So, after hearing all this about, the different kingdoms coming up into the future, Nebuchadnezzar, well, to say the least, was impressed. Okay? He was very much impressed by Daniel, not only telling him the interpretation, but telling him what the dream was and what the king was thinking before he even went to sleep to have the dream. And in fact, the king prostrated himself. He bowed down, basically went face down, completely on the floor before Daniel, ordered people to burn incense to him, and Daniel, of course, couldn't really do much because this is the king getting that order, and made the following statement that could very easily be interpreted as a confession of faith. And this came from Daniel 2:47. Truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, even though this sounds like a confession of faith, it isn't. It was an acknowledgement of the power of the God of Israel, but it was not a rejection of all the other gods in the Babylonian pantheon. Okay? He recognized God as just another one of those gods, a very powerful one I don't want to mess with, but he's just one of many. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar had his own personal god. In fact, his name derived from it, and that was Nabu or Nebo, the Babylonian god of wisdom. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar, Nebu, that's where he got his name from. So here we are in chapter 3. Now, most scholars believe this is about 20 years later. This is very likely a celebration of the final overthrowing of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar had to go back 3 times. Daniel came back the first time. There was a second exile. The prophet Ezekiel was taken in that one. He was a priest. And then in 586 BC, the final judgment came onto Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar took the city. He took people captive. He destroyed the city. He destroyed the temple. And now he's back in Babylon. And this seems to be kind of maybe in a way a celebration of that victory. Okay? But there's more going on here. He's trying now, he's through with his conquest, he's trying now to unify his kingdom using religion. And this was logical to the pagan mind since his gods clearly defeated all the rest. So he's going to kind of rub it in their faces religiously. So here, let's take a look and see how he's going to go about doing this. Daniel 3, starting in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, and the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, and the harp, and the lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Stop there. Now, it's been 20 years since Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. Okay? And believe it or not, there is a connection here. And that dream was probably so intense, he probably still remembered it. But he kind of forgot some of the insights that he had. So when he made this statue, he remembered, I am the head of gold. No, we're going to make the whole thing out of gold. And I'm going to let you know now, this thing was probably not solid gold. Now, 60 cubits by 6 cubits. That's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Okay? So it was probably covered, it was probably made out of wood or some other material and then covered in gold leaf. There was just not enough gold in the entire Babylonian Empire to build a 90-foot tall solid gold image. And to kind of address how big that is, 90 feet, that's about the height of a 9 to 10-story building. So this thing was huge. Okay? This thing was big. And so he's basically kind of boasting to God that, no, my kingdom's going to last a long time. It's all going to be gold. And there was an element of pride here. You saw it. You knew it. And to be honest, to the king's credit, this statue was not him. There's no records of any of the kings in that part of the world being worshipped as gods while they were still alive. Now, that may have happened after they died. That was more of a Roman thing. Okay? No, the Babylonian kings, no, this was probably Nabu. It was probably the Babylonian god of wisdom that was basically, for lack of a better word, Nebuchadnezzar's patron god. Okay? And he wanted to make sure it's clear to everyone, I'm a builder. Which, by the way, history shows he was very much a builder. This was very much in line with his character. Now, Daniel made it clear, and when he interpreted the dream, that no empire was going to last. Okay? And that included Nebuchadnezzar's empire. And the king himself was under no delusion that at some point his kingdom was going to end. Okay? But he had common sense. He wanted to make sure, you're right, I'm not going to live forever, despite what everyone tells me. Everyone addresses the king. Oh, king, live forever. And I'm sure he's thinking, thanks for the wishes, but I know better. Don't even go there. But he was going to make sure he set it up so his legacy would go on and on and on. And the statue was kind of in symbolic of that. But there was a second point here. He wanted to make sure that those people underneath him were loyal to him and there were going to be no rebellions. Okay? So what did he have to do? You basically worship my God. That was his choice. If you're going to be my viceroy, if you are going to be a loyal citizen, you're going to be, especially if you're in the government, I need to know that you are on my side. And if you're willing to worship my gods, then I know that's the case. Okay? And he figured, if you don't, well, nearby was this smelting furnace. Now, it wasn't built especially for it. They did a lot of smelting in those days, iron, gold, and what have you, taking the ore taking the metals out of the ore, and it required a furnace. I would say the ones that I've seen pictures of were about maybe half the size of this room. They're pretty large. And they had places where you put the ore. You had places that would collect the molten metal. You had fuel that was burning everywhere. You had holes that allowed oxygen to come in. You had doors that allowed you to enter and exit. On the top, there was a small stack that allowed the fumes and all the smoke to go out. And there were other places where they had billows. Okay, I don't know if you remember those or not. These big old things you push up and down that took air. It was like a supercharger or a turbocharger on a car. It would cause more oxygen to go in and cause the fire to burn hotter. So how hot do these things get? Well, don't think about your oven at home at 350 or even up to 500 degrees. In order to smelt, for example, iron, the temperature had to get over 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That took a lot of fuel, and the fuel usually was wood. At this point, they were starting to use charcoal. Coal wasn't a thing yet. An old charcoal is wood that's been put in a place that's oxygen poor, heated up, and so it turns into pure carbon, but it's a very efficient fuel. But wood, charcoal, stuff like that went in there. And so you think of yourself, this is an awesome sight. You got a 9-story statue sitting there, and you've got this rather large furnace off to one side that is completely stoked up and burning. And I know if you've ever had a campfire or even a large fire at a fireplace, fires are not soundless. They make noise. And one as big, say, half the size of this room, this becomes a roaring fire. It is extremely loud. Everybody is standing there. They see the statue. They see the furnace. They're knowing what's going to happen. And they're listening. They're thinking, okay. They're hearing the herald tell them what's going to happen. You either bow or you're going to go in the furnace. They're looking at the furnace. And trust me, it took a lot less imagination to know what was going to happen to you if you got thrown in that furnace than if someone threatened you with a simple beheading. Nebuchadnezzar knew what he was doing. He wanted to make sure they understood, he meant business, and he indeed meant business. So all these guys, they're all representative of all the nations that Babylon had conquered. Okay, they go through the list, the satraps. Those are like the regional governors. Okay, there weren't too many of those. You had the lieutenant governors. You had the magistrates and the judges, and some of the other governors, as they called them, who were experts in the law. They were basically the judicial branch. And what we see is a very well-organized bureaucracy. And it was right down to the provincial officials, like the dog catcher or the postman or things like that. People who worked for the government. Every level of authority was there, but they represented, that's why they said all peoples, all languages, all tongues. They represented everybody. So in essence, you bow, all your people are bowing at the same time. Okay? This was going to be a religious service, and as we do religious services, I know very few churches, there are some that don't, but most churches I've attended over my lifetime have music as a part of worship. Okay, back in the old days, it was the organ and the piano and the old hymns. But if you don't think that causes worship, you've never been to one of those where the person's on the organ just going away and the piano and the lady in the front with the tambourine, who's usually the pastor's wife, leading worship, and all these people raising their hands and praising God through the old hymns. Okay? Music, and there are some churches that will not have music. There are very few. Some denominations, you view music as unnecessary. I don't know why, but the Bible makes it pretty clear that music is an important part of the worship of God. Okay? Think about all the musical instruments that David created. He wasn't going to be able to build the temple, but he was going to set down the framework for it. And he created all sorts of beautiful musical instruments just for temple worship. And you see glimpses of heaven, like in the book of Isaiah or the book of Revelation. What do you see? People singing in worship to God. Okay? Music is a very important part, and Nebuchadnezzar understood this. In fact, the word worship is used 11 times here in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to set the stage because he knew if you got the right kind of music, you can stir up the emotions, and these people are going to be able to do anything you tell them to do. If you've ever been to a secular concert, okay, a lot of times those things rival worship services, okay? You'll see people raising their hands, or sometimes they have a cigarette lighter and they're waving it back and forth. But a lot of times it's like they're worshiping, they're singing along. And you look at this, it's like, man, if this were a religious service, if this were actually a church, this would be amazing. Okay? That's because the devil knows how to use music to his advantage, as well as we know how to use music to our advantage in worshiping to the Lord. This has been true forever. Okay? Ever since man was able to make music. They learned certain types of beats will elicit certain responses in the body. Okay? That's why you have to watch out about, in general, secular music, modern music especially, that has a pretty heavy beat because it triggers certain chemicals in the body. Okay? That's why so many weird things happen at secular concerts. Okay? Again, if you've been to one, you know what I'm talking about. And yes, I have been to one. Okay? Not that Neil Young was that wild, but it was interesting. Okay? But it was a fascinating concert. But I saw a lot of what I just described there. Okay? And essentially, if you use the music right, you can get whatever you want. So Nebuchadnezzar knows this. Herod says, okay, guys, when you hear the music, you bow. If you don't bow, he probably pointed at this furnace over there. Guess where you're going to go? And to be honest, I think most of that crowd didn't need much convincing. They were a superstitious bunch. They were accustomed, and we're not talking, even the Jews at this point. Remember why they're in Babylon in the first place. Idolatry. So there's a lot of Jews standing out there, and we're going to talk about the exceptions in a minute. But to them, hey, bowing before a bunch of gods or goddesses, that's an easy one to obey. We do it all the time. And yeah, in light of that obvious consequence over there, that furnace that's just burning merrily away, because now it has a different function today. It's an instrument of execution, and a very effective one at that. Now, this shows us that the difference between the true believer and the unbeliever isn't the presence of faith, okay? Because everyone has faith in something, okay? Even an atheist has faith in something, okay? Even if they have faith in the fact that when they go on the freeway, nothing's going to happen to them. That's faith, all right? The difference between a believer and an unbeliever is the object of that faith. A believer knows the Lord is with them. That's the object of faith. The unbeliever, it's whatever they can see. Okay? The herald said, do this and live. They saw the herald, they saw the king, they saw the furnace. They obeyed. No problem. And so the service begins, and the music plays, and it's forming a proper setting. And it was probably, they call all kinds of music. It was probably very beautiful. These were the royal musicians. They didn't make mistakes. They played whatever music that was appropriate for that time. And as soon as they heard that music play, everyone bowed to the ground. And they were thinking, yep, we're loyal to you, Nebuchadnezzar. We're loyal to the Babylonian government. And yes, if we ever break our vow to you, you can kill us. That's essentially what's happening here. All the foreheads touched the ground except 3. Verse 8. Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set aside or set up. Stop there. Now a question pops up at this point. A lot of people ask, where was Daniel? Okay, after all, this is the book of Daniel. He was the one that had Nebuchadnezzar promote his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, to high positions in the province of Babylon. And he himself was the governor of the province of Babylon. Okay? So where was he? I mean, it's happening in his province. You'd expect him to be there, and we would expect the king to insist on his presence. But the Bible doesn't tell us anything, so we go into the realm of speculation. And to do this, we have to consider some facts we know about Daniel. Now, one suggestion is that Daniel was ill and couldn't attend, so the king excused him. And this is based on him getting ill an awful lot later in the book. You have to remember, later in the book, he was in his 70s and 80s. Here, he was in his 20s or 30s. Don't think that's the issue. Others believe he had been sent away on a special mission by the king and was away from home. Okay, that seems to fit the facts. Here's an interesting one. Third suggestion is that Daniel, being the governor of the Babylonian province, was behind the scenes, making sure that everything was going smoothly. I doubt this seriously because Daniel would not want to participate in an idolatrous assembly. He would not do it. He would stand firm and say, no, king, you have someone else do it. You can fire me, throw me in the furnace. I'm not going to do it. But there is another option, okay? Nebuchadnezzar knew that the God of Israel had worked through Daniel at least once when he interpreted that dream. And there probably may have happened more. After all, Daniel 1 tells us that Daniel himself was very gifted in interpreting dreams. And that statement wasn't based on a single incident. That statement was based on a whole series of them. So Nebuchadnezzar is thinking, yeah, this is the God who showed me the dream through Daniel. I don't think I want to force him to make a choice between his God and mine. Because, and this is pagan thinking now, I don't want to put Daniel in a position where his God's going to strike him dead for bowing to my God. So he sent Daniel away for his own safety. Now, again, this is speculation. The man's faithful service affirmed his loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. So that makes sense. I'm not going to say that's the truth, but this makes sense that Nebuchadnezzar was aware of the power of the God that Daniel worshipped. But remember, Nebuchadnezzar is still a polytheist. Okay? He did not connect the relationship between Daniel's God and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego's God. But he's soon going to make that connection. So, we're not exactly certain how the ceremony went, but it's clear that Nebuchadnezzar and his advisors were not in the same place. They're not standing in this platform looking and seeing everybody. The impression I get is the advisors were wandering around, making sure everybody was worshiping. Okay? And they probably already gave their oath of allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar, and he probably said, okay, guys don't have to do this. Maybe they bowed ahead of time. We don't know. But they're around. Kind of like the people at the dinner table when you're saying grace. There's always someone who's looking around to seeing who doesn't have their eyes closed. Okay? Don't touch that. It's like at Thanksgiving dinner. So they're looking around, and they see these three guys standing tall. Everyone else is on their face. These guys are still standing. Now, obviously Nebuchadnezzar didn't see them. But these guys, these advisors, they refer to them repeatedly as Chaldeans. And you can tell by their words that they were jealous of the fact that these three Jews were so high up in the province of Babylon. They were Jews. They were a conquered people. They weren't the master race of Chaldeans. And so when they saw these guys standing, they went directly to the king and saying, "Oh, king, remember and they quoted the entire edict. These Jews that you appointed." They try to even rub it in. You appointed these guys. They don't worship your gods. They're not listening to you. They're standing up. They're not paying any attention to your commands. That's right. I mean, these are the same three guys who braved the wrath of the king early on by refusing to eat the king's food and drinking his wine because it was unclean according to Mosaic law. And they were not going to compromise there. And it came out okay. Okay? They stood tall because they knew the law of Moses, and they knew what had destroyed Judah and Israel in the first place. Okay? To quote from Exodus, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." They knew why they were in Babylon was because Judah in particular screwed up and refused to listen to this command from the Lord. Once the Lord has spoken on a matter, it's settled. The matter is settled, and there is no room for discussion. There's no room for compromise. Okay? To bow before that image, even once, would have destroyed their witness and would have broken their fellowship with God. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego would not bow down to the golden image even once, because they were not going to be ever seen serving Nebuchadnezzar and his gods for the rest of their lives. They said, we know what the commandment of God is. Sorry, king, it trumps you. Okay? Their faith, and again, it goes back to the object of their faith, was in the true and living God, and in the word that he had spoken to their people. And they were aware of the history of the Jewish people. And they knew that as long as they remained faithful, God was still in control, and they had nothing to fear. Now I have to wonder, they're standing there, and they may not be aware of any snitches yet, but they're standing there, and there's this 9-story tall statue, and they're standing straight up, and then they're looking over at that furnace roaring away. I wonder if they thought about the words of Isaiah the prophet in chapter 43. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. And when you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. That was written 100 years before this incident. And here's the thing. They knew that furnace sitting there, that threat, if you don't obey, you're going to get thrown in the furnace. They know it's not an idle threat. They know that Nebuchadnezzar was going to throw them in there if he found out about it. And I think they all realized, that verse we just were thinking about in Isaiah, that may be put to the test pretty quick. Didn't sway them. Faith means obeying God regardless of the feelings within us and the circumstances around us or the consequences before us. It doesn't matter. We need that faith. So, the jig is up. The Jews have been snitched on. Let's see what happens. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And so they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Ooh. As angry as this guy was, he was furious. This is insubordination. He kept his clear enough head on who these men were. Okay, he promoted them. Okay, the offenders, when he ordered them to be brought forward, and then he asked them, "Is this true?" And I think this was more of in the name of justice, because he was aware of how valuable these men were, how they had proved themselves loyal over the past 20 years. And I think he was even aware of the jealousy and intrigue of the people in his palace. He knew that these guys may have a point, but they also are maybe looking for a reason to get rid of them because of jealousy. Well, he didn't wait for an answer, Basically, is it true? Well, if you're here, it's kind of like the logic. If you arrested him, obviously he's guilty. Okay? But he says, well, if this is true, he just says, okay, if you're ready, let's do this again. And this kind of implies he thought, well, maybe, you are Jews. Maybe there's some little thing you have to do before you worship, and you just weren't ready yet. Okay, I'll give you that. Okay? And so he's giving him the benefit of the doubt. All right, we're going to do this again just for your benefit. We're going to have him play again. I mean, everyone's going to bow and you're going to bow. But if you don't, and he probably pointed at that furnace, if you don't, you're going to go there. And then came his challenge. What God will be able to rescue you from my power? Okay? This was his mistake. He turned this confrontation into a contest with God. Now, he should have known better. Perhaps he didn't put the two, perhaps he didn't know. He didn't put two and two together. He's scoffing at the same God who granted him success in battle, who granted him the throne of Babylon, and the same God who revealed the future to him in a dream. And basically saying, he's not going to do anything. He can't do anything. And he's now set himself up, king though he may be, on a road to undergo one humiliation after the other. But at the moment, Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was holding the winning hand. And here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego respond. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Now, this was not the answer Nebuchadnezzar wanted to hear, though I'm sure it was delivered in a very respectful manner. The fact that they referred to him by name, Nebuchadnezzar, knows that they are close. Okay? No underling would refer to the king in so familiar a fashion unless there was a precedent for it. I've heard some teachers say, oh, they're doing that out of disrespect. Out of character, guys. These guys were respectful. They basically said, look, we don't, they're saying, look, we don't have to defend ourselves. We don't have to defend our God, because our God is going to defend both himself and us. And they weren't the least bit worried. Yeah, I'm sure they saw, they definitely heard at this point, still heard the furnace. But it's interesting, because if we really think this through, they didn't feel the need to defend God, because God does such a good job of defending himself. And it really is a bit arrogant for any believer to think that they have to defend God. You can't. God defends himself, and he takes care of his people. And in fact, God can defend us better than anybody, including ourselves. I know a lot of pastors who talk about this. They hear that someone's talking about them behind their backs. Okay? Dangerous habit in a small town, by the way. Okay, because everyone knows about it. But the response is, well, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Let God handle that. He'll take care of it. I don't have to worry about it. Okay? And again, I'm wondering if these three men were thinking, again, back to Isaiah, this time from chapter 12. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. He also is become my salvation. They have promises that God's going to take care of them, and they are standing by those promises, and they are not pleading for an exception. Interesting to note that. They're not saying, look, Nebuchadnezzar, you know better. We're not going to be bad, so just exempt this from us and we'll move on from that. No, they basically threw down the gauntlet and said, no, we're not going to do it. Sorry, king. We like working for you, but this we cannot do. They knew that the Lord was going to deal with this king who thought he was the sovereign on earth. And this goes back to true faith. It's not frightened by threats, impressed by crowds, or swayed by superstitious ceremony. True faith obeys the Lord and trusts him to work out the consequences. Now, it is true, and there are people that may have been in their position and may have done that. They might have compromised. Okay? They're thinking to themselves, oh, yeah, well, everybody else is doing it. Okay? Or our office demands that we obey, so I got to do it. And this next one, I always love this one. We'll bow our knees, but we won't bow our hearts. It doesn't matter. True faith doesn't look for loopholes. It simply obeys God and knows that he's going to do what is best. Faith rests on the promise of the God, not on arguments or explanations or excuses. But there's another point in their reply that is often overlooked. Let me read this to you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. They were men of faith. These three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, were men of faith, but not men of presumption. Had they affirmed that God would deliver them, honestly, it would have been a presumption because they didn't know what God had willed for that situation. Instead, they stated that God was able to deliver them. But then I like what they add. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to obey you. We're not going to bow down. We're not going to worship your gods. Now, sometimes people have this idea, and we call it commercial faith. Commercial faith says we will obey God if he rewards us for doing it. I got news for you. That's Satan's philosophy of worship. Basically, the relationship with God is based on what's called quid pro quo. What does that mean? Well, you're getting a favor or advantage granted or expected in return for something. Okay? People who hold to this philosophy don't stick around very long in a church because God doesn't work that way. Okay? I've known people who view, and this is one example, but there are many, but I'm going to use this as an example. I know people who view tithing as insurance or an investment of some sort, complaining that they are not getting what they are expecting from their tithing, thus they won't do it anymore. Oh yeah, I've tithed all this time and I got nothing out of it. Okay? I've heard people say that. Now, some may point to the book of Malachi that tells us that God will bless a tither and that we are to test him on this. Is there a contradiction here? No. Because you have to read the whole passage of Malachi and realize what's the issue is. It's motivation. It's all motivation. If you do anything with the wrong motivation, God is not going to bless it. What's the motivation should be? Love. 1 Corinthians 13. Okay? Even when I speak with the tongues of men or angels, if I give up my body to be earned, or I give away all my belongings to the poor, if I do not have love, it is nothing. That's what he's talking about. If tithing is fire insurance for a person, God isn't going to bless that. And a lot of it is, in essence, if you don't have that love for others, the love of Christ, not love for yourself, okay, that's not the type of love we're talking about. Any tithing, anything you do in service of God is worthless because of the lack of or the wrong motivation. Just don't do it. If that's what your motivation is, don't do it. Okay? Remember, and I mentioned this early on, remember that nowhere in the New Testament are Christians commanded to tithe. Okay? You always see that giving to the church was a voluntary act of love and service to the Lord, giving back to him a portion of what he has entrusted with us. All that we have is the Lord's. We have been made stewards of what he has given us, and as we have seen, if we are not good stewards of what he has entrusted with us, we will be dispossessed. Now, we still have our salvation. But since we insisted on getting our rewards here on earth, there will be none in heaven. Read the Sermon on the Mount about that idea. Okay? They got their reward. And you don't get your reward twice. And it all boils down to bargaining and lack of love for Christ and others. And then there's other people I've heard. Again, they're trying to get something from God. They make promises to God so they can persuade them to their will. I always love when I hear somebody say, I've been wrestling with God over this issue. And it's like, well, you're going to lose. Remember, the whole point of prayer is not to wrestle with God and change his mind. The whole point of prayer is to align our will with his. That's, if there's any wrestling going on, it's because we're trying to resist that. Okay? But we're still going to lose. And this was kind of, talked about here and there. They want to, for example, a person is sick. They want to persuade God to heal them. So they promise, God, if you heal me, I will do this, and this. And I have seen situations where God did heal them, but they didn't do this, and this. Okay? And in fact, when it happened again a second time, they tried to pull the same stunt, and it didn't happen the second time. This is not believing in God. This is bargaining with God. And no, you can't bargain with him. True faith confesses the Lord and obeys him regardless of the consequences. From the very beginning of their time in Babylon, Daniel and his 3 friends determined that they were going to be different. And the Lord enabled them to maintain that determination, and God rewarded their faith. But he doesn't always step in and perform miracles. Okay? Now we know this. Not everybody that we pray for is healed. Okay? But God always gives a person a strength to bear with the pain and grace to face death without fear. Okay? We don't know why this isn't happening. We know he can heal. It's not a case that he can't. He knows he can heal. But it's not within his will for some reason, and we're in no position to criticize or presume that we know exactly what God's will is. Okay? The 3 Hebrew men, these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, believed that God could deliver them, but they would trust him even if he didn't. This echoes from the book of Job. In the midst of the first of his trials, the loss of his wealth and family, Job says, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay? And you go a little bit later when he's lost his health and he's in the middle of a circumstance that I hope none of us ever have to face. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That is how faith is supposed to operate in our lives. So as far as God was concerned, Nebuchadnezzar laid his challenge. God said, challenge accepted. But as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, well, at that point, they were through there. Verse 19, and Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Then he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Proud men do not like to be disobeyed. Therefore, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar's rage took control, and he started giving absurd orders. Now remember what I said about these furnaces. They operate at about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. No mortal could survive an instant in that temperature. But, oh no, he has to heat it up 7 times. I'm sure toward the end you might have actually even seen the walls glowing. It was so hot. But let's face it, that was actually a rather foolish command. Because from a medical point of view, if you want someone to suffer while they're dying, you turn down the heat. Because you throw them in at that temperature, they're dead already before they hit the ground. And they didn't suffer any. No, you turn down the heat so they suffer a little bit. But he's thinking, no, I want to make my point. And here's the funny thing. He makes sure they're fully dressed. Why? Just because he can. This is one of those times where he actually is acting somewhat capriciously. Okay? And it was so hot that the guys that were tasked to throw them in were killed. Okay? I hope you never experience 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit heat. If you ever do any smelting, you will. But even standing in front of an open oven at 350 or 400 degrees is not a pleasant experience if you're not expecting it. It can actually do damage in your lungs if you let that happen. Okay? And remember, this thing was pretty big, half the size of this room, and there was a huge door, so the whole thing was visible. But this execution didn't go according to plan. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, and I'm sure he was pointing at that point, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Despite all these elaborate preparations and 3,000 degree temperatures and the untimely death of several guards, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego weren't affected by the fire at all. The only thing that burned was the ropes that held them bound. They're walking around in there, and like I said, there was plenty of room to walk. I'm sure they were stepping over the burning, wood and charcoal and whatever was in there. And the king's sitting there is like, there's a 4th guy in there. And remember, pagans are very superstitious. Immediately he's looking at it, he's saying, and some translations say he looks like the son of a god. Okay? Here he says he looks like the Son of God. And it was. He was right. That 4th person was Jesus himself in his pre-incarnate appearance. One of his pre-incarnate appearances in the Old Testament. There are several others. We'll talk about those later. They were walking around that furnace like they were in a palace. Okay? The ropes were gone. They're there. So much for Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. Verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of the fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yield their bodies, that they should not serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made in an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego in the province of Babylon. Now there's a minor miracle that just took place, and again, people miss it. Remember, this thing is broiling hot. It just killed a bunch of people who just came near it. And remember, the fire is burning noisily away. The fact that the king got close enough that he could yell over the sound of the fire was a miracle. Okay? But it happened. He comes out. He calls them, and there, out they go. It's boring in here. Well, see you, Jesus. We'll be back. And out they go. And the 4th one disappeared. Okay? And everyone present just crowded around them. And this was a huge crowd. And they're looking at them, and they probably maybe kept touching close to them. It's like, they're not even hot. 3,000 degrees. They're not even hot. I mean, this was a sight. 3 men sent to execution inside a fiery furnace, and they lived to tell about it. Unhurt, unharmed. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. Challenge completed. Nebuchadnezzar, 0. It was now God, 2. And before such an awesome display of God's power, Nebuchadnezzar could only acknowledge his own defeat. He hastened to praise the Lord and confess his admiration for the courage of his servants. And then to make amends, he decreed death and destruction for anyone saying anything against the God of Israel. This seems to be a favorite of him. Remember that term ash heap? It's basically public latrines and garbage dump. Okay, so that's his idea of, urban renewal. I don't know. Okay? And then he promotes these 3 guys to a higher office in Babylon. Not sure where, because Daniel was at the top. Now, this sounds like another confession of faith, but to be honest, it still wasn't, because the king still didn't get it. And we're going to be looking at that next week in chapter 4. And the two are connected because of that. Now, what's the takeaway from this point? Well, first off, don't take God for granted. Now, it's highly unlikely that we're ever going to face execution in a fiery furnace like these guys did. But realize God is going to be able to remove us from any situation that we face if he is in his will. And if he doesn't, he won't. Now, James tells us to count it all joy when we fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of our faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That may be why God holds off on certain situations. Lord, I'm in this horrible mess. I know. You're not ready to come out yet. Okay? God is not our servant. We have to remember that. We are his servants, and we always have to remember that no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, there's a reason, and we need to be patient with the Lord to either reveal the reason or patiently let the Lord work through his will for us. And our patience will be rewarded. People who are too anxious because this is not perfect, this is not right. God never said you were perfect. Now, granted, he made us perfect through Jesus Christ, but we're still human. We still make mistakes. And graciously, he forgives that. Okay? But again, God is the one we answer to. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego showed this. Even if he does not, we're standing firm. And no matter what we face, that should be our mantra. Even, Lord, if you don't take us out of this mess, we are going to stand firm for you. Yeah. Father, we thank you again for all that you've done for us. And as we move into communion, we ask you to just, again, put into our hearts that strength to stand no matter what the conditions, what the circumstances, whatever we find ourselves in. Because we know that we are to count it all joy. We know that the testing of our faith strengthens us. We become stronger for you. We become a better witness for you, Father. Because people will see that we can go through all sorts of horrible things, but still having a smile on our face shows the true joy that you have placed in there. And it is a joy that a lot of people want. And it's not hard, Father, for us to follow you. All you tell us is we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in our hearts that, God, you raised him from the dead. We are saved. And at that point, we turn and give our lives to you as a true gift, not as a lending situation. And once you have our way with us, it is so wonderful, the beauty of serving you. And we need to keep that always in our minds, Father. You are our master. We praise you now, Father. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.